The farmer lived alone for years until he bought the last Apache woman left behind. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Reed Halston guided the tired mule team down the main stretch of Redstone Crossing with the same slow steadiness he used for every job that kept his ranch from collapsing. His coat was dusted the color of the road. His beard needed trimming again, but he hadn't bothered in weeks, and his eyes, washed out gray from years of sun and squinting, moved over storefronts and men and horses without any need to linger, because he didn't come to town to look at people. He came for salt, coffee, lamp oil, nails, and a new whetstone because the old one had cracked clean through. He told himself that was all. In and out. No delays. The last time he had stayed in town past sundown, some drunk brought up the war and the dead and the part Reed played as a Union scout. And Reed had stopped talking and left because there was nothing to say that could make any of it different. His wife had been dead 10 years, buried on a hill behind the cabin with a simple cross and a stone he turned over with his own hands. The ranch was half alive, sometimes less than that, but it was still standing. That was his mission now. Keep it standing, keep the fence rails mended, keep himself fed, keep the days moving in a straight line. He would have gone straight to the general store if not for the noise coming off the old livery yard. Men gathered close, some laughing, some spitting, some standing with that empty attention that comes when there's nothing to do and cruelty passes the time. Reed didn't slow because he wanted to. He slowed because the path narrowed with bodies and because he heard the word auction and last one left and worthless, and his hands tightened just a touch on the reins before he set the brake and stepped down. He saw her at once. She was chained to a rough-hewn post, wrists red and bruised from iron. She stood upright, not stiff, not slumped, just upright. Her chin was level. Her eyes were clear and focused on nothing in front of her, like she had learned it was safer to look through men than at them. Her dress was torn, deerskin with fringe that had once been carefully placed, beads and feathers still hanging in some spots. The neckline ripped down so far it exposed the top of her chest and the curve of her cleavage. And there was no attempt to cover it, because there was no extra cloth and because modesty hadn't protected her from anything. Her skin held the color of the country she came from, sun-warmed copper, and the muscles along her bare arms and calves showed a life of work and walking and not breaking. She was young, maybe 24. Her hair was black and long and tangled, parts of it braided, parts of it pulled loose by days of wind and handling. Men had been jeering her. He could see that in the set of their mouths and the careless way they leaned in, but she hadn't reacted. She hadn't given them anything. She ain't spoke a word. A man near Reed said, not looking at him, just announcing it to anyone listening. 3 days. Others sold quick. Not her. Wouldn't kneel. Wouldn't cry. Just stands there. He spat. Folks say she's cursed or stubborn or both. Reed's jaw worked once. He didn't answer. He stepped closer. His boots sank a fraction into the dry soil. The woman's eyes shifted, finally, and landed on him. There was no plea there. No hope. No friendliness. No relief. Just a read of him, fast and exact, the way a person checks for threat and decides what to do next. He knew the look. He'd worn it after the war. He still wore it some mornings when he woke and had to remember there was nothing chasing him anymore but memory. He could leave. He knew he could. He could buy his nails and coffee and go home and pretend he hadn't seen her. And he would mend fence rails and oil his lantern and sit by the fire thinking about nothing in particular until Sunday, when he walked up to the grave and told her nothing had changed. But he also knew this. If he left, she would still be there when the sun went down, and some man with less patience and less restraint would have coined his pocket and ideas in his head, and the outcome would be certain. Reed reached inside his coat. His fingers found the folded bills and a few coins he had counted twice that morning. He stepped to the man who seemed to be handling the trade. "How much?" he asked, voice low from disuse. The man blinked, surprised both that Reed spoke and that anyone was interested. He named a number that was less than what Reed had in his hand, but more than the woman was worth to him after 3 days of not selling. Reed didn't haggle. He put the money in the man's palm. The man shrugged, satisfied with something for nothing, and bent to unlock the chains. "You want a bill of sale?" the man asked. "No." The chains fell. The weight left her wrists, but she didn't rub them. She didn't move until Reed turned away. Then she stepped forward because standing there wasn't safer than following, and because every choice left to her was a bad one, but some were worse. Reed didn't touch her. He didn't guide her. He didn't say anything. He walked back to the wagon and climbed up. She climbed in after him and sat on the plank seat, her hands resting in her lap, her shoulders steady. She glanced at the coat he wore, then away. He noticed the cold coming in from the north and the way her torn dress would handle it. He took off his coat and held it toward her. She stared at it, then at him, and finally she took it but didn't put it on, just held it over her legs. They left Redstone Crossing with the sound of boots and laughter behind them, and nobody followed, and the mule team moved on the road in a rhythm Reed knew by heart, and neither of them said a thing for miles. Reed's mind kept circling back to his land. What needed repairing, how much feed was left, the broken hinge on the chicken coop door, the way winter would close in fast this year if the sky stayed the way it was. He glanced once at her wrists. The skin was raw. He watched her glance toward the horizon and then down at her hands. She kept her face still. He wondered how long she had been moving through the world, keeping her face still. Her name, he would learn later, was Awanada. She had been taken in a raid, dragged through miles of scrub and rock, stripped of language by men who laughed when she didn't answer, and left unsold because pride does not move itself for the sake of anyone's comfort. Her mission now, if the word could even fit, was to stay alive without giving up the last of what made her feel like herself. She would not kneel. She would not beg. She would not say please to men who had none to offer. Survival without bending. That was the line in her head, thin but unbroken. Reed's mission had been simple for years. Keep the ranch breathing. Keep himself useful enough to justify another day. Keep his dead wife remembered without letting the grave swallow the rest of his years. Buying her hadn't been in that plan, and he wasn't sure what it meant now that he had. But he knew he hadn't brought her home to own her, and he knew the cabin had room for another bed, and he knew the silence in that place had gotten too heavy to carry much longer. Dusk laid a flat orange light over his land when they arrived. The fence line leaned, the pasture grass was thin, the barn door stuck if he didn't lift it just right. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the well. Climbed down. She waited, watching his hands, studying what he did and how he moved. He offered a hand to help her down. She looked at it, didn't take it, stepped down on her own, her bare feet hitting the packed dirt, and a flash of pain crossed her eyes when the ground bit at the raw spots, and then it was gone again. He opened the cabin door and stepped aside, letting her go first so she could see the space before he moved into it. The cabin was one room with a short wall built half across it to suggest separation, a wood stove that needed a new seal, a table he had built himself with uneven legs, 2 beds, his and a smaller one he had made when his wife got sick and couldn't climb in and out of the higher frame. He gestured toward that bed. "Yours," he said, "if you want it." He didn't say anything about the door staying unlocked or locked, or about chores, or about where she could and couldn't go. He didn't draw rules because he didn't know yet what she needed, and he wasn't going to pretend ownership gave him the right to decide it. She stood still, taking everything in: the stove, the bed, the small shelf against the far wall with a folded shirt and a basin on it, the window with a nailed-down shutter, the smell of wood smoke and oil, and the faint trace of a woman's soap that lingered on things Reed hadn't thrown away. Her eyes stopped for a second on a ring that lay on the table, not worn, just kept. Reed followed her gaze, then looked away. He slid the ring into his pocket without comment. "I'll make food," he said. "You can wash. Basin's there. Water's clean." He ladled stew into 2 bowls, thick with beans and the last of the summer squash. He set one bowl near her bed and one on the table for himself. He didn't sit across from her. He gave her space to decide where to eat. She chose the floor by the fire, cross-legged, coat across her lap, eyes on the flames. He sat at the table. The room held 2 people and a silence that wasn't hostile, only heavy with new facts. Reed ate slow, listening to the scrape of her spoon against the tin. He thought about the next morning, animals to feed, fences to check, wood to split. He thought about whether she would want to help or prefer to be left alone. He thought about the men in Redstone and how quick they had been to label her useless when what they meant was she wouldn't pretend to be less than she was. When the bowls were empty, he took them, washed them, set them to dry. He laid an extra blanket on the end of her bed and a second one on the chair nearby in case she didn't want to sleep in the bed at all. He pulled a rough plank and a stack of old feed sacks from against the wall, measured the space with his eyes, and started planning where to build a proper divider in the morning so she would have privacy without needing to ask. He didn't say it. He just noted the measurements in his head. Night settled without ceremony. He banked the fire, blew out the lamp. The cabin sank into a low, orange glow. She lay on a small bed, eyes open. He lay on a larger one, staring at the roof beams he had cut himself, counting the knots the way he always did when sleep didn't come. He heard her breath even out, but not deepen. She wasn't sleeping either. Both of them were listening to the stove, to the night outside, to each other's quiet presence. Reed thought of the grave on the hill and how he would walk up there on Sunday and stand with his hat in his hands and tell his wife the truth. I brought someone home because leaving her there felt like leaving you, and I couldn't do that again. He felt the old guilt rise and settle. He let it sit. He didn't push it away. He didn't let it rule him either. Awanada stared at the ceiling and tried to slow her heart because the sound of a door shutting in darkness still put her back in places she didn't want to remember, and the smell of a strange man's space still made her hands twitch ready to fight. And yet there had been no hand on her arm, no order, no threat. He had given her a bed and a coat and silence. She decided to stay awake long enough to hear if he moved toward her. He didn't. Hours passed. The fire settled to coals. The cold pressed at the walls. Neither of them slept, but neither of them left. In the morning they would work. They didn't know it yet, but the work would become their language. For now, surviving the first night under the same roof without fear or demand was enough. That was the start. That was the mission on both sides. Stay, do no harm, make the space livable, see if trust could exist without being forced into existence. The next morning broke cold. Reed woke to the sound of the wind pushing against the wooden walls and the faint pop of cooling embers in the stove. He turned his head just slightly and saw her, Awanada, curled on her side on the small bed across the room, Reed's old coat tucked around her knees. Her eyes were shut, not deeply asleep, but resting. The faintest furrow in her brow told him enough. She'd stayed awake most of the night, same as him. He sat up, joints aching the way they did every morning now. The floor was cold under his bare feet. He moved quietly, not to be courteous, but because noise had long ago stopped being necessary in his life. He dressed, pulled on his boots, stoked the fire, and put water on to boil. When he stepped outside, the air bit deep, dry, hard, high country cold. The sky was clear. The pasture stretched toward the hills in a brittle line of yellowed grass and rusted fence posts. He fed the mule, threw a cracked bucket of oats to the hens, and checked the lean-to where a busted hinge still needed mending. Everything was where he left it, quiet, tired, in need of repair. But there was another set of footprints in the dirt now. Smaller, barefoot. When he returned to the cabin, Awanada was awake, sitting upright, legs pulled in close, her long hair curtaining part of her face. The coat still covered her, but the torn dress underneath showed more than it hid. Reed glanced once, then looked away, not out of discomfort, but respect. She didn't try to cover herself. She hadn't moved the cot. She hadn't touched anything. Her hands were folded in her lap. "I made coffee," he said, setting a tin cup near her bed. "No sugar." She looked at the cup, but didn't reach for it. He didn't press. He sat down at the table with his own and took a sip, wincing slightly at the heat. He needed to say something. He wasn't sure what. She hadn't spoken since the auction. He didn't even know if she spoke English. He doubted it was fluent, if at all. But there were things she needed to know, even without language. "I'll be fixing the fence line today. Got a section down up past the North Trail. After that, the chicken coop needs a new hinge. There's tools outside, if you know them." She said nothing. She only blinked once, slowly. "You can stay here if you want," he added. "Or come. Your choice." He didn't tell her she was free. He didn't know if she'd believe him. Freedom was a word too many men used before doing the opposite of what they promised. He just laid the facts down, plain as he could. She eventually stood, slowly, stretching her legs with a quiet stiffness that said she was used to sitting too long in one position. Her bare feet touched the floor with hesitation, and Reed noted the redness on her soles. He crossed to a shelf, pulled out a pair of worn moccasins, too small for him, kept from when his wife had once tried to learn leatherwork, and laid them by the edge of her bed. "They might fit," he said. "If not, I'll fix them." She looked down at them, then up at him. She didn't thank him, but she gave the faintest nod. It was enough. He went out, started working. By the time he was halfway to the north fence line, she was behind him, walking slowly, wrapped in the coat, the moccasins on her feet, her hair braided back now. She didn't ask what to do. She watched him work, watched the way he drove the post deeper, tied the wire, reset the support beams. After maybe an hour, without a word, she picked up a second post and began helping. Her hands were rough, capable. She had done this kind of labor before. They worked without speaking. The wind carried dust around their boots. He handed her a mallet when hers cracked. She didn't smile, didn't look grateful, just accepted it and kept swinging. When they rested, he poured water into a shared canteen and held it out. She drank carefully, then gave it back. That afternoon, they returned to the cabin. Reed chopped wood behind the barn. Awanada knelt near the chicken coop, inspecting the hinge. She disappeared for a moment and came back with wire and a rusted nail. Fixed it herself. He didn't say anything. Just watch her go inside, quietly, deliberately. She didn't eat much that night. A few bites of salted pork, a biscuit. She ate slowly, chewing like she had to remind herself to do it. Her eyes didn't stray far from him. Never suspicious, but aware. Reed cleared the table and lit the oil lamp. He took out wood and nails and started measuring space near the cot. She sat nearby, arms around her knees, silent. As he worked, hammering slowly, she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, cracked from disuse. "Why?" He paused. She said it again, firmer. "Why did you take me?" He set the hammer down and looked at her. His eyes were tired but steady. "Because no one else should have," he said, "and because I had room." She stared at him for a moment, then lowered her gaze. "I don't want to be owned," she said. "You're not. Not wife. No. Not slave. No." She nodded once, sharp and final. That was the deal. That was enough for now. Later that night, Reed sat by the fire, slowly cleaning an old bridle. Awanada moved toward the stove, placed a blanket near it, and lay down on the floor instead of the cot. When he looked at her, she said nothing, just stared at the ceiling. He left her be. She didn't trust the bed. That was fine. Trust would take time. He knew that. He didn't expect her to feel safe here. He only hoped she'd learn she didn't have to run anymore. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance. Inside, the warmth of the fire spread slowly across the floorboards. Reed looked over once before turning in. Her eyes were still open, watching the dark beams above. She wasn't afraid, not exactly, just alert. And she hadn't run. That was something. Tomorrow would come. So would the next one. If she stayed, he'd build the divider higher, fix the roof over the shed, make another cot. If she left, he wouldn't stop her. But she hadn't left, and he hadn't asked her to. That was where they were. Not family, not strangers. Something in between. Not bound by words or paper, but by the fact that neither one of them had walked away. Not yet, and maybe not ever. Morning came with frost edging the windows. The fire had died down to a low heat, but the cabin still held some of yesterday's warmth. Reed stirred early, as always, sliding out of bed in practiced silence. When he glanced across the room, he saw her, Awanada, still on the floor beside the stove. She was curled under the blanket, one hand tucked beneath her head, the other resting lightly over her chest. Her breathing was even, her eyes closed. He dressed and stepped outside to start the morning chores. A layer of ice had formed over the water trough, thin but solid enough to need breaking. He used the heel of his boot, then filled 2 buckets to bring inside. There was a rhythm to the morning, tending to animals, splitting kindling, checking that nothing had gone wrong overnight, and Reed moved through it with the same deliberateness he always had. Only now, he was aware of her presence in a way that tugged slightly at each thought. Not a burden, not a distraction, just a new shape in the old life. We came back inside. She was already up, standing by the window, her arms crossed, still wrapped in the coat he'd given her. She didn't startle when he entered, but her body went a little tenser, like she didn't trust any room not to shift beneath her. He set the buckets down near the basin. "There's hot water on the stove," he said, voice low. "If you want to wash up proper." She didn't answer, just nodded once and stepped away. He turned his back and gave her space. While she cleaned herself, slowly, cautiously, using the warm water and a scrap of cloth, he busied himself with the stove, frying leftover salt pork and grinding coffee beans. When she finished, she returned the basin to its place and moved back to the far wall. He noticed she had cleaned her face and arms. Her hair was damp, brushed back. Her cheeks were red from scrubbing, but her shoulders were less rigid. They ate at the table this time, not speaking, but not avoiding either, just eating. She watched him between bites, her eyes moving over the lines of his face, the way he held his fork, how methodically he chewed. He noticed, said nothing. Afterward, he pointed toward the barn. "I'll be clearing the south pen. The snow's coming early this year." "I'll come," she said, surprising him. Her voice was firmer than before. Not strong, not warm, just sure. He didn't argue. He simply pulled on his coat and handed her a pair of work gloves. She accepted them without expression. They spent most of the day in the yard behind the barn, where broken wood and old fencing had been piled in disuse. Reed hadn't gotten around to sorting it the year before. Now he and Awanada moved the scrap together. She hauled what she could, her hands still raw but steady. He caught her grimace a few times, but never heard complaint. At midday, they sat on a log and shared a piece of dried meat and bread. The wind had picked up. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. He studied the sky. "You ever work a ranch before?" he asked finally. She was slow to respond. "Then, my father had sheep. Not cattle, but I worked." He nodded. "I can tell." She glanced at him, then back at her hands. "Why do you live alone?" Reed shifted. The question didn't sting. It just came from farther away than he'd expected. "My wife died. Long time ago." Awanada's face didn't change, but her eyes dropped to the dirt. "You had children?" "No." She nodded like she understood something unspoken, like that explained everything. After a moment, she said, "They sold me because I wouldn't obey. I wasn't quiet enough." He didn't answer, just watch her face. There was no tear in her voice, no pity in the telling. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was just saying what needed to be said so it wouldn't rot inside her. He said, "You don't have to be quiet here." She looked at him again, long and hard. "Even if I speak against you?" she asked. He met her gaze evenly. "You can say what you need." That night, she slept on the cot instead of the floor. He noticed when he rose to bank the fire before bed. She had pulled the blankets tight to her chest. Her arm curled under her cheek. She looked more at peace than she had any night prior. He didn't mention it the next morning, didn't bring it up at all, but he left a folded shirt by her bed, soft cotton, something his wife had once sewn for herself but never wore. Awanada picked it up, held it to her chest, then laid it aside. That day, she helped him mend the chicken pen. She collected the eggs. She swept the cabin when he went to the pasture. Later, as dusk came, she stood at the threshold of the cabin, staring toward the western hills. He came up behind her quietly. "You looking for something?" he asked. She answered without looking back. "Sometimes I think I'll see someone, my sister, maybe, or a scout, something from before, but never comes." He nodded. "I look too, every Sunday." She turned then, brows drawn slightly. "For her." He didn't answer out loud, just nodded. They stood there in the doorway together as the sun dipped low, side by side, not touching, not speaking more. But something had shifted. They were no longer two strangers under the same roof. They were two people beginning to share a life, uneven, quiet, but real. In town, they'd called her unsellable. Here, she was learning to be seen. And he, Reed Halston, the man who hadn't spoken more than 5 words a day for 10 years, was learning that staying didn't have to mean staying buried in the past. The following days unfolded without incident, but something had changed between them, subtle as it was. The silence was still there, but it had softened. Awanada no longer kept her back to him when she moved through the cabin. She no longer flinched when he came in from the yard. Reed noticed how she began tidying without being asked, stacking firewood, sweeping out the corners, brushing down the mule's coat after he came in from the field. She didn't act like a guest or a servant. She simply moved like someone who had decided, for now, to stay. The shirt he'd left by her bed was being worn now, loosely, over the torn dress. The sleeves were too long and the fabric hung low over her curves, but she didn't seem to mind. It covered her more than before, though her deerskin dress still peeked from underneath, worn, frayed, especially at the neckline. The rip across her chest hadn't been repaired. When she bent forward, the fabric parted slightly, exposing the warm curve of her cleavage. Reed caught himself looking once, just once, then forced his gaze to the floor. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did and simply didn't care anymore. The tension between them wasn't desire. It was something slower, weightier. It came from sharing space without force, from surviving together in silence. On Thursday, she followed him out to the far field where the fencing needed mending. The sun was harsh that day, and she worked with sleeves rolled up, sweat trailing down the line of her throat. He offered her water. She drank without hesitation. Then they kept working. Midway through the afternoon, she asked something that caught him off guard. What happened to her? Her voice was quiet but clear. Your wife. Reed didn't answer right away. He kept tying wire to the post, then leaned back against the fence and wiped his brow. Fever, he said finally. Got sick one spring. Didn't get better. She lasted 6 days. Buried her behind the cabin. Awanada looked toward the tree line. No children. No family. None that stayed. She nodded slowly, like that made sense. Same. They stood in the field, wind rustling the grass around them, the sun shifting lower in the sky. Reed asked, Your tribe, they think you're dead? She didn't answer for a long time. Then, maybe, or they wish I were. I was supposed to marry someone. I refused. They said I dishonor my father. After the raid, no one came looking. That was all she said. It was enough. When they returned to the cabin that evening, Awanada washed at the basin while Reed lit the lamp and stirred the stew. He watched her in the glass reflection, her long hair loose now, her collarbone visible through the open shirt, the scars and marks that told quiet stories he didn't ask to hear. Her body was strong, but no longer guarded. There was still war in her, but it wasn't against him anymore. After dinner, she sat by the fire, cross-legged, her eyes half-lidded in thought. He sat in the chair behind her, his hands working slowly on a broken strap of leather. The fire crackled. A long time passed before she spoke again. I don't know what I am here. Reed looked up. She continued, voice low. Not a wife. Not a slave. Not part of a tribe. I wake up, I work, I eat. But I don't know what I'm becoming. He set the leather down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You're someone who's still standing, he said. That's more than most. She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. And you? What are you now? He thought about it. Tired, he said, but trying. The corner of her mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Almost. Later, as the fire burned down and the shadows stretched longer across the floor, she moved closer to him. Not quickly, not directly, but with purpose. She sat beside his chair on the floor, near enough that their knees nearly touched. Reed didn't move. His heart was beating slow but heavy. She placed her hand over his, rough palm against calloused knuckles. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her. She didn't speak. He didn't pull away. That night, she slept in the cot again. But before she lay down, she reached out and touched his arm as he passed by. Just a small touch, a thank you, or something else entirely. Reed lay awake longer than usual, listening to the quiet of the cabin, the steady breathing across the room. He didn't know what they were becoming. He only knew that the silence between them no longer fell hollow. It felt like the start of something that didn't need a name yet. And for the first time in a decade, he didn't visit the grave the next morning. He stayed inside, and so did she. The snow came earlier than expected. It began as a thin flurry just before dawn, fine white dust brushing against the window glass. By midday, It thickened into a slow, steady fall that blanketed the ridge lines and softened the edges of the pasture. Reed stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching it coat the fence posts. It was quiet, still, the kind of quiet that pressed into your chest. Inside the cabin, Awanada stirred the fire, her shirt sleeves rolled up, hair braided tight down her back. She moved differently now, still alert, still guarded, but not like she was waiting for something to break. She moved like she lived there. Reed came in, stomping the snow off his boots. She handed him a warm cup of broth without a word. He nodded, grateful. Their routines had settled into something close to rhythm. He still rose early and took care of the livestock. She cleaned, mended, prepared meals when she felt like it, and joined him in the fields when the weather allowed. But something unspoken had begun to shift. Neither of them had said it out loud, but the touches were more frequent now. A hand brushed against a shoulder when passing, a quiet moment at the table when their eyes stayed locked a little too long. It wasn't romantic in the way stories tell it. It was quieter, slower, earned. That evening, as the storm thickened and the wind beat harder against the cabin walls, Awanada pulled her bedding closer to the fire. She wore the same patched deerskin dress beneath Reed's shirt. The shirt gaped slightly at the chest now that the buttons were worn. The heat from the fire had made her skin flush faintly, and the curve of her neckline was visible in the lamplight. Reed noticed, but not with hunger. It was something closer to sorrow, like looking at something that deserved better than it had ever been given. "I never asked where you learned to mend fences," he said suddenly. Awanada glanced up. "My grandfather taught me. He said if you could fix a fence, you could keep anything alive. Livestock, people." Reed nodded, then sipped from his cup. After a moment, she asked, "Why don't you ever go to town? Not even for church?" He shrugged slightly. "There's nothing there for me. Town doesn't change." "I did." She tilted her head. "People talk about you." "I know. They say you went mad after the war." He set the cup down. "I came back with less than I left with. That's not madness. That's math." Awanada didn't smile, but she understood. She moved closer to the fire. The lamp flickered low. She sat near his feet now, her legs tucked beneath her, one hand on the floor, steadying herself. "I used to think silence was punishment," she said quietly. "After I was taken, they didn't speak to me unless to command. I stopped speaking too. It was easier." Reed looked at her, his voice low. "Here, silence isn't punishment. It's peace." She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. Slowly, that night, she stood before the stove, waiting for the coals to settle. Reed sat behind her, rubbing his palms together from the chill. She turned to him, took a step closer, then another. He didn't move, just watched her. She reached out, placed a hand on his chest, flat and warm, right over the place where his heartbeat lived. Her eyes didn't ask anything. They just looked. Reed's voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you sure?" She nodded. I stayed, and with that, she leaned in, pressing her lips softly to his. It wasn't long. It wasn't heated, just real, present, a choice. Reed didn't pull her in further. He didn't lead. He let her decide everything. She pulled back after a moment and stepped away, back to the cot. She didn't say goodnight. He sat there long after the fire settled, his chest tight. Not from desire, but from something heavier. The sense that for the first time in years, he might not be alone anymore, and that she might finally feel the same. By morning, the snow covered everything in sight. But inside the cabin, something had warmed, and neither of them would name it. Not yet, but both had stopped looking at the door. By the second week of snow, the road into Redstone was iced over and impassable. The ranch became its own world, white, still, and sealed off. Reed kept the fire burning through the day, hauling in chopped wood twice daily. Awanada swept, boiled broth, patched torn blankets, and mended leather straps by the window while the storm outside howled like a voice, trying to call them back to a life neither of them missed. Inside, they moved around each other without the old stiffness. They didn't speak much, but when they did, the words came easier. Reed didn't ask her about the men who had taken her. Awanada didn't ask what Reed had done during the war. They shared everything but the pain that had come before, because that didn't need explaining. She slept in the cot still, but But each night, she placed it closer to the fire and closer to his own bed. She didn't say why. He didn't ask. But when the fire crackled low at night and her hand dangled over the edge, she no longer pulled it back if his hand brushed hers. One evening, the lamp burned low and snow fell thick outside. Reed was at the table, sharpening his knife. Awanada sat across from him, running her fingers down a line of old cotton cloth she'd salvaged from mending. Her shirt hung loose, exposing the curve of her chest through the torn dress beneath it. He didn't look away this time, and she didn't hide. Her voice broke the silence. Was she beautiful? Your wife. Reed blinked once. Yes, but not like people mean when they say that. Awanada tilted her head, waiting. She was quiet, strong, didn't need anything from anyone. But she stayed anyway. Awanada looked down at the table. You still think about her? Every Sunday, he said. But lately, less like I'm holding on, more like I'm letting her rest. A long pause followed. She stood, moved toward the fire, and knelt to stoke it. Her shirt fell open slightly with emotion. When she turned back, her eyes stayed on him longer than usual. I've been thinking, she said. If I asked to stay, not just for winter, but longer, what would you say? Reed set the knife down. I'd say you already are. That answer seemed to settle something between them. She didn't speak again. She simply moved back across the room and sat beside him, not across from him. She rested her hand on his leg, fingers light, unsure. He covered it with his own. That night, they didn't say goodnight. When the lamp was turned down and the fire glowed low, she stepped over to his bed. No words, just her hand resting against his chest again, this time with more certainty. He sat up, met her eyes. You don't owe me anything, he said quietly. She shook her head once. I know. He moved over, pulled back the blanket, and she slid in beside him, carefully, slowly. Her skin was warm, soft against the rough wool. They lay there, shoulder to shoulder, silent. For a long time, neither moved. Then she turned toward him, placed her hand on his jaw, and kissed him, longer this time. He kissed her back, carefully, like touching something half-broken that had been repaired too many times. Their bodies pressed together beneath the blanket, close but unhurried. She let her hand move to his chest, and he let his drift to her waist. Their breathing deepened. When he touched her collarbone and traced downward, he paused, giving her space to say no. She didn't. What followed was not rushed or desperate. It was slow, steady, quiet. Awanada moved first, letting her shirt fall, letting his hands find the warmth beneath. Her curves against his chest, her breath in his ear, his hands firm but careful, steady as everything else he'd ever built. When they came together, it was not possession, but return, two people who had been taken apart by life choosing, for once, not to run. Her body curled against his, her breathing deep, and even afterward. He held her until she fell asleep, arms wrapped around her bare back, the fire still glowing at their feet. It was the first night neither of them had dreamt of before. Only what might come next. Morning light slipped through the frost-glazed window panes, casting a cold glow across the cabin's wooden floorboards. The fire had burned down to a faint orange pulse in the hearth, and the snow outside stretched in soft drifts over every surface, muffling the world into stillness. Inside, Reed lay awake, Awanada's body pressed lightly against his side, her dark hair spilling over his shoulder. She was breathing softly, her cheek against his chest, the blanket drawn up to her waist. Her hand rested on his ribs, unmoving, familiar. It was the first morning in years that Reed didn't rise immediately with the sun. He stayed still, present, grounded. Her warmth beside him felt like something earned. Eventually, she stirred. She didn't speak at first, only shifted her head slightly to look up at him, her expression open, calm. There was no embarrassment in her eyes, no hesitation. Reed met her gaze with a quiet nod, his hand gently moving to the back of her shoulder, resting there. You didn't leave, she murmured, voice husky from sleep. Didn't plan to, he said. She looked away for a moment, thinking. Then, no man I've known ever stayed after they got what they wanted. I'm not like those men. I know. They sat up slowly, the cold air biting at their skin. She slipped a shirt back on and tied the bottom over her hips. The torn deerskin dress beneath it still clung in places, the fringe frayed and the neckline gaping, but she didn't adjust it. Reed dressed quietly. There was no awkwardness between them. No need to define what had happened. It had been real, mutual wanted. That was enough. Over breakfast, Awanada asked, "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" Reed paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "I used to. Not anymore. Because of me?" He met her eyes. "Because of what I found when I stopped running." She sat back slightly. "I used to believe I'd have to go back, that it was wrong to want something else." "Do you still believe that?" Her response took a moment. "No, not now." Later that day, while Reed repaired a broken axle on the wagon, Awanada remained inside and cleaned the shelves, humming softly to herself in a language he didn't recognize. Her presence was no longer quiet in the same way it had been before. It wasn't fearful or distant. It was deliberate, rooted. She filled the space differently now, without asking, without apologizing. Reed walked in and paused in the doorway, watching her stand on tiptoe to reach the top shelf. The shirt pulled tight across her back, her hair braided down to the middle of her spine. She turned slightly, and her eyes caught his. "You're staring," she said with a hint of a smile. "Just looking," he replied. That night, they didn't speak much. But after the fire was lit, Awanada took a slow walk around the cabin, her bare feet making soft prints across the wooden floor. She moved toward the table, opened the drawer, and found the small ring Reed had once kept hidden, his late wife's. She held it in her palm, then turned to him. "I saw this before," she said. "You kept it." He nodded. "I didn't know why for a long time. Do you now? I think I was waiting for it to mean something again." She walked over, slowly, and placed the ring on the table in front of him. Her voice was steady. "I'm not her. I know. I won't replace her. You're not supposed to." Silence fell again. Awanada looked down, then back up. "Then what would it mean now?" Reed took the ring, stood, moved around the table. He didn't kneel, didn't ask. He just held the ring out, open in his palm. Awanada's eyes filled with something close to shock, but it wasn't fear. It was weight. The weight of being chosen, not taken. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply reached forward, slid her fingers into his hand, and let them close around the ring. That night, she slept in his bed again. But this time, she didn't lie at the edge. She curled into his chest, her leg hooked around his, her arm resting over his heart. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, just a little. A faint drip from the eaves. The first sign of spring. They didn't talk about marriage. Not yet. But she stayed. And so did he. The snow softened into slush by the third week of March, revealing patches of earth that hadn't seen light in months. The fields were muddy. The barn roof still carried weight from the last storm. But the air smelled different now. Less like ash, more like wet dirt and thawing roots. Spring was near. Inside the cabin, Reed woke to Awanada, already dressed, crouched near the hearth and coaxing the fire into steady flame. The shirt she wore was his, slightly too large, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and beneath it, the familiar deerskin dress still clung around her hips, mended now with bits of cloth and sinew. She didn't look back when she noticed him stir. She just said, "Coffee's almost ready." He sat up slowly, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. "You sleep?" "A little." "You cold?" "Not with you beside me." That quiet reply sat between them for a moment, heavier than it sounded. After breakfast, Reed went out to check the fence line. Awanada joined him without needing to be asked. They worked in silence, side by side, setting posts and retightening the sagging wire. She moved with purpose, her hands calloused now from the months of labor. Reed had started giving her more of the tools, not because he needed her help, but because she used them well. At one point, she paused, hands on her knees, and stood slowly. "My monthly didn't come this week." Reed looked up, uncertain if he'd heard her right. "I'm late," she said. "I've counted twice." He stepped closer, slow and careful. "You think?" "I don't know yet." Her voice wasn't afraid. It was measured, real. "But if I am, are you ready for that?" Reed exhaled once, deeply. He didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the land, toward the sloping hills where the trees were starting to bud. Then he looked back at her, her strong arms, her steady jaw, her quiet gaze that didn't flinch anymore. "I never thought it'd happen," he said. "Not again. Not this late. Not after everything. But if it's you, then yes. I'm ready." She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased, and then she leaned in, pressing her forehead gently against his chest. He placed his hand on the back of her head and held her there for a long while, letting the moment settle inside both of them. That evening, as the wind rose and the clouds gathered again, Awanada stood at the window, watching the trees sway. Reed brought in firewood. When he entered, she turned to him and said plainly, "If I carry your child, I want them to have a name. A home. I want to belong here." "You do," he said. "You already do. But I mean fully," she replied. "Not as someone rescued. Not as a guest. As your wife." He set the firewood down and crossed the room. He didn't wait for ceremony. He took the ring from the shelf, where it had rested since she placed it back days ago, and handed it to her. "You sure?" She nodded. "Yes." He slipped it on her finger. Her hands trembled slightly. "Then you're my wife," he said. "Not by law, by choice. Mine and yours." That night, they lay together without urgency. They undressed slowly, not out of nervousness, but intention. She let the shirt slide off her shoulders. Her body, warm and curved, met his without resistance. Their breathing matched. Her hands found his skin with ease. When they came together, it was quiet, like before, but this time with purpose. There was no past in the room now, only the present, only the firelight flickering on their joined bodies, only the promise of what came next. Afterward, she rested with her cheek against his chest. He stroked her hair. She whispered, "If it's a boy, we name him after your father." Reed smiled faintly. "And if it's a girl?" Awanada replied, "We let her name herself." He kissed her forehead, slow and deliberate. Then they lay still, listening to the wind move through the trees, as if the land outside was starting to breathe again. So were they. The sun returned slow and golden in April, casting long, warm beams through the thinning clouds. Mud gave way to soft soil, and the snow line retreated into the hills. Reed stood by the edge of the field, leaning on a post he'd set years ago, watching as Awanada crouched by the fresh sprigs of spring onion she'd planted along the fence. Her belly wasn't showing yet, just a hint of fullness, a still quiet possibility. But her movements had changed. She moved with more care now, with intention. She touched the soil like it meant something more. She glanced up at him, shielding her eyes from the sun. "You're staring again." He smiled faintly. "I know." They hadn't gone back to Redstone Crossing since winter. There was no need. The ranch had what it needed, and what it didn't have, they learned to live without. Awanada had mended her own dress with care, piece by piece, patching the neckline and the seams with old linen Reed offered her. It still hung low on her chest, snug against her full figure, but no longer looked torn or forgotten. It looked like hers. The cabin had changed too. A second shelf had gone up by the table, hers for her things. A cradle, half-carved and unfinished, sat near the hearth. A divider now split the far end of the room where she had once slept separately. It wasn't needed anymore, but they left it there out of respect for what once was. Reed still visited the grave behind the cabin, but not every Sunday now. Not out of guilt. He went when it felt right. Awanada had joined him once. She didn't speak at the gravesite, just knelt beside him and laid down a single white stone. That was all. "I think," she said one morning while washing her hand in the basin, "when the baby comes, we should bury the old ring there." Reed paused, drying his hands on a cloth. "At the grave." She nodded. "Not because it's the end of something, but because it gave us this." He thought about that, then agreed. "We'll do it together." Around the second week of April, a rider from Redstone arrived with supplies. A younger man, new to the route, unsure of Reed's reputation. The rider tied off his horse awkwardly and approached the cabin while Reed stood on the porch. Awanada was inside, unseen, but she heard every word. "Brought what you ordered. Tobacco, flour, needle packs, salt," the rider said. He glanced around, then added cautiously, You still living out here alone?" Reed didn't answer right away. "Then, no." The rider squinted. "You got someone helping?" Reed stepped forward slightly. "I've got a wife." The rider looked surprised. Not mocking, just curious. "Oh, huh. Well, town still got folks talking about that Apache woman from the sale last fall. Some said you took her in." Reed's eyes stayed steady. "I didn't take her. She chose to stay." The rider shifted his weight awkwardly, then nodded and left the packages near the porch. "Well, sounds like she's lucky." "No," Reed said simply. "I am." The rider nodded again, a little more respectfully this time, and turned to leave. That night, after dinner, Awanada sat cross-legged on the floor, sharpening one of Reed's old knives. The firelight danced across her bare arms, her collarbone visible through the open neckline of her now-repaired dress. Reed sat nearby, watching her with quiet ease. "You think folks will always talk?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, "but it won't change anything." "I don't care what they say," she added. "I know." She set the knife aside and reached for his hand. He took it, letting their fingers intertwine. "Will you tell me about her?" Awanada asked after a long silence. "Your wife." Reed nodded. Her name was Claire. She was small, always cold, and she liked things tidy. She laughed loud, louder than anyone expected. Awanada smiled. "She sounds nothing like me." "No," he said, but she stayed. "So do you?" She rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you love me the same way?" He thought about it honestly. "No, I love you the way I didn't think I'd be allowed to again." Awanada didn't reply. She just kissed his jaw and leaned into him. That night, she placed the ring in a folded scrap of linen and set it in a carved box near the cradle. Reed watched her from the bed, understanding without needing explanation. The ring's journey was complete. It didn't mean forgetting. It meant making room. Spring came in full the next morning. Birds nesting near the eaves, the mule braying from the pen, a soft fog lifting off the hills. Awanada stepped onto the porch with one hand resting low on her belly, the other shielding her eyes from the sun. Reed joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist. She leaned against him. "You still think this ranch has a future?" she asked. He nodded. "Because you're in it." They stood in the light, facing the open land. There was no more silence that needed to be broken, no more past left to bury, no more question of whether they belonged. They had stayed, and in doing so, they had built something no storm, no man, and no memory could take away. A home, a family, a future, and for the first time in both their lives, they were not surviving anymore. They were living, together, for good.